February 2026 changed things at airport security checkpoints in ways that most travelers haven't caught up with yet. Not dramatic headline changes. No single sweeping policy announcement that made national news. What changed was the enforcement threshold, the technology deployment timeline, and several procedural updates across TSA, EU security directives, and major international hub protocols that collectively mean behaviors that passed without incident 3 months ago are now generating secondary screening referrals, confiscations, and in some cases, formal penalties. The travelers getting pulled aside right now are not first-time flyers who don't know the rules. They are frequent travelers running on muscle memory from 2024 and early 2025 procedures. People who packed the same bag, walked the same checkpoint routine, and assumed that what worked last quarter still works today. That assumption is now expensive. Here is exactly what changed, why it matters, and what you need to do differently, starting with your next trip. 1. CT scanner. Deployment reached critical mass in February. The single biggest operational change affecting checkpoint behavior in February 2026 is not a policy update. It is a hardware deployment milestone. TSA's CT scanner rollout crossed the threshold where the majority of U.S. airport security lanes at major and mid-size hub airports are now equipped with computed tomography scanning technology rather than traditional flat-panel X-ray. The practical difference is significant. Traditional X-ray produces a two-dimensional image that requires trained human interpretation to identify threats and violations. CT scanning produces a three-dimensional rotating image that automated threat detection software analyzes in real time before the human officer reviews the result. Liquids, dense objects, and organic materials that appeared ambiguous or borderline on flat X-ray are now being identified with substantially higher accuracy and consistency than the previous technology allowed. What this means in practical terms: items that passed through traditional X-ray checkpoints without flagging, slightly oversized liquid containers that looked borderline, lithium batteries buried deep in packed bags, organic material in food items, tightly packed electronics that obscured other contents, are now being caught consistently. The technology doesn't have an off day. It doesn't wave things through during a busy period. It doesn't miss the container at the bottom of the bag because the angle was wrong. Travelers who calibrated their packing behavior to the inconsistency of human-reviewed flat X-ray are now encountering a system that applies the same standard to every bag on every pass. The rules didn't change. The enforcement certainty did. And the gap between the two is where the current surge in checkpoint delays and confiscations is originating. 2. The liquid rule is being applied to the container, not the contents. This is the specific enforcement detail generating the most passenger frustration at CT-equipped checkpoints right now, because many travelers genuinely believe they are complying with the 311 rule when they are not. The rule is not about how much liquid is in a container. It is about the labeled capacity of the container itself. A 200 milliliter travel bottle that contains only 50 milliliters of shampoo fails the rule. The container is rated above 100 milliliters regardless of fill level. A 150 milliliter perfume bottle that is 3/4 empty fails the rule. A prescription medication in a pharmacy-labeled bottle sized above 100 milliliters requires additional screening regardless of medical necessity, though medical liquids have a separate declaration process that allows them through with proper documentation. The confusion has always existed, but traditional X-ray human reviewers applied this rule inconsistently. Some officers flagged the container size, others assessed visible fill level. CT software flags container volume, regardless of contents. The February deployment acceleration means more lanes are applying this standard than at any previous point, and travelers who have been getting away with the fill-level interpretation are now being stopped consistently. The fix is simple and costs nothing. Transfer liquids into containers that are labeled 100 milliliters or 3.4 ounces or smaller. Travel-size containers are inexpensive and widely available. Alternatively, purchase toiletries at your destination and avoid the carry-on liquid calculation entirely for longer trips. 3. Lithium battery enforcement moved from check-in to the gate. The regulation on lithium batteries has not changed. What changed in February is where and how it is being enforced, and the change caught a significant number of travelers who believed they had already cleared all relevant security requirements. Airlines, including all three major US carriers, updated their gate agent protocols in January and February 2026, following FAA guidance issued in late 2025 regarding high-capacity portable charging devices. Gate agents at boarding are now actively identifying and flagging power banks and spare lithium battery devices above 100 watt-hours during the boarding process, not at check-in, not at the security checkpoint, but at the gate as passengers queue to board. A power bank confiscated at the gate means one of three things. It goes back to check-in to be checked as cargo if time permits, it is surrendered permanently, or in the case of devices above 160 watt-hours, it is refused transport entirely. Discovering this at the gate with 20 minutes to boarding is not a recoverable situation in most cases. The 100 watt-hour threshold calculation. Multiply your power bank's milliamp-hour rating by its voltage and divide by 1,000. Most consumer power banks advertise milliamp hours prominently and don't display watt hours on the device face. A 26,800 milliampere hour bank at 3.7 volts is approximately 99 watt hours, permissible without airline approval. A 30,000 milliampere hour bank at the same voltage is approximately 111 watt hours, requires airline approval before travel. Devices above 160 watt-hours are prohibited on passenger aircraft without exception. Check every power bank you own before your next trip. Write the watt-hour calculation on a piece of tape on the device if it isn't printed. If you need airline approval for a device between 100 and 160 watt-hours, obtain written confirmation from your carrier before arriving at the airport. 4. Powder substances. The February threshold update. TSA updated its powder substance screening protocol in February following a revision to international security coordination standards. The change affects travelers carrying powders in carry-on bags in quantities that were previously below the threshold, triggering mandatory additional screening. The previous informal guidance suggested that powders in quantities under 12 ounces in carry-on were unlikely to trigger additional screening. The updated protocol applies more consistent scrutiny to powders above, approximately 350 grams, roughly 12 ounces, but has also lowered the threshold at which CT software flags dense powder substances for officer review. Protein powders, coffee, spices, powdered supplements, baby formula, and similar items are not prohibited, but they are now generating secondary bag checks at CT-equipped checkpoints at volumes that represent a significant increase over previous months. The practical adjustment for powder-carrying travelers. Pack powders in checked luggage when possible. When carry-on transport is necessary, separate powder containers into an accessible outer pocket of your bag so they can be quickly removed for inspection without unpacking your entire carry-on. Powder items in clearly labeled original manufacturer packaging move through secondary screening faster than unlabeled containers, which require additional officer verification time. Medically necessary powders, including baby formula, are handled through the same medical liquids exception. Process. Declare them at the checkpoint before your bag enters the scanner. 5. The laptop and large electronics requirement is expanding. The requirement to remove laptops from bags for separate screening has been standard since 2006 for non-pre-check passengers. What changed in February is the category of devices triggering the same requirement at an expanding number of checkpoints. Large tablets, specifically devices with screens above 10 inches, are now being flagged for separate tray placement at CT-equipped checkpoints without pre-check designation. This includes iPad Pro models, large Android tablets, and similar devices that most travelers have been leaving in their bags under the assumption that only laptops required removal. The CT scanner's higher imaging resolution makes the dense battery and processor components in large tablets more visible and more likely to obscure underlying bag contents, triggering the same screening logic that established the laptop removal. Rule: e-readers, standard tablets below 10 inches, and smartphones are not affected. The rule applies specifically to large tablets that approach laptop dimensions and density. If you're traveling without pre-check and carrying an iPad Pro or equivalent large tablet, remove it and place it separately in a tray before your bag enters the scanner. Not doing so generates a bag pull that takes 3 to 5 minutes to resolve, longer than the removal itself would have taken. Pre-check passengers are not affected by this change. The pre-check lane protocols explicitly exempt electronics removal. If you travel frequently and don't have pre-check, the February changes make the enrollment ROI calculation more compelling than it has been at any previous point. 6. Wrapped gifts are now a guaranteed secondary screen. This is the change generating the most surprise among travelers who weren't aware it was formalized in February. Wrapped gifts in carry-on bags, holiday packages, birthday. Presents any item with wrapping paper or opaque decorative packaging that obscures the contents. Now trigger mandatory secondary screening at CT-equipped checkpoints rather than the officer discretion process that previously applied. The CT scanner cannot penetrate dense wrapping materials with the same imaging clarity it achieves on unwrapped items, and the three-dimensional imaging software flags obscured interior spaces as requiring manual verification. There is no exception for clearly innocent-looking shapes, ribbon-wrapped boxes, or gift bags with tissue paper. If the scanner cannot produce a clear image of the contents, the officer must manually inspect. Manual inspection of wrapped gifts means the wrapping is opened. There is no procedure for re-wrapping at the checkpoint. Your options are to unwrap before reaching security, ship gifts to your destination before traveling, pack them in checked luggage, or accept that they will be unwrapped during screening. This rule existed informally before February. TSA has always reserved the right to unwrap gifts during screening. What changed is the mandatory application standard at CT checkpoints and the removal of officer discretion that previously allowed clearly harmless-looking wrapped items to pass without unwrapping. 7. International checkpoints. The EU Security Directive Update. European airports operating under the updated EU Aviation Security Regulation that took effect in January 2026 implemented checkpoint procedure changes that are catching US travelers on outbound European legs and connections through major EU hubs. The most impactful change for US travelers transiting through EU hubs. The liquid exemption that previously applied to duty-free purchases made airside at non-Schengen airports no longer applies uniformly across all EU member state airports during security connections. Duty-free liquids, including alcohol, perfume, and cosmetics purchased in sealed security bags with receipts, that were previously exempt from the 100 milliliters rule during EU connection security are now subject to individual airport interpretation of the updated directive. Specific airports including Amsterdam Schiphol, Frankfurt and Paris CDG have clarified their implementation publicly. Others have not. Travelers connecting through EU hub airports with duty-free liquid purchases should verify the specific policy at their connection airport before assuming sealed duty-free bags will pass without issue. Additionally, the EU update formalized enhanced screening requirements for footwear at certain risk-designated checkpoints. Previously an intermittent practice at European airports, now a consistent requirement at specific lane designations. Slip-on shoes that facilitate quick removal are a practical response to this change for frequent EU travelers. 8. The behavioral detection element. Nobody talks about. February's procedural updates included enhanced deployment of behavioral detection, protocols at major US checkpoints, a less discussed but operationally significant change that is contributing to secondary referrals among travelers who have never had a checkpoint issue before. Behavioral detection officers positioned at checkpoint queues are specifically trained to identify indicators of stress, deception, and anomalous behavior that may warrant additional screening referral independent of what's in the bag. The February update expanded staffing deployment of these officers at high-volume checkpoints and updated the referral criteria to include more subtle behavioral indicators than previous protocols targeted. The practical implication is counterintuitive. Travelers who are anxious about checkpoint procedures, particularly those running late, those carrying items they're uncertain about, or those who have read about rule changes and are nervous about compliance, can display behavioral indicators that generate secondary referrals for entirely innocent reasons. The most effective preparation is complete compliance that removes the source of anxiety. Know what's in your bag. Know your liquids are compliant. Know your electronics are organized for removal. Know your power bank wattage. A traveler who is genuinely prepared has nothing to produce anxiety at the checkpoint, and that preparation communicates itself behaviorally in ways that make the entire process faster and smoother than nervous compliance uncertainty does. 9. Real ID and passport. The document check acceleration. Document verification procedures accelerated in February at several major U.S. airports implementing upgraded identity verification technology. The change affects travelers whose identification is technically valid, but whose document condition has deteriorated, worn magnetic strips, faded photographs, cracked laminate, or damaged barcode areas that prevent automated reader verification. A driver's license that scans successfully in your state's system may not. Scan successfully in TSA's updated automated verification readers. When automated verification fails, manual officer verification is required, which takes longer, generates a queue disruption, and in some cases results in enhanced screening, even when the document is ultimately accepted as valid. Check the physical condition of your real ID or passport before travel. A license with a cracked laminate or worn edges that you've been successfully using for domestic purchases may not meet the condition standard for automated checkpoint verification. Passport pages that have been stamped heavily near the biometric chip area can affect chip reading in automated passport control systems at international arrivals. Renew any document showing physical wear before your next international trip. The processing timeline for passport renewals currently runs 6 to 8 weeks for routine applications. Factor that into pre-travel planning rather than discovering the issue at the checkpoint. Every change that took effect or accelerated in February 2026 shares a common characteristic. It removes the inconsistency and human discretion that experienced travelers learn to navigate and replaces it with automated, consistent enforcement that applies the same standard to every passenger on every pass through the checkpoint. If this reached you before your next trip rather than during it, share it with someone who travels and hasn't seen these updates yet. Subscribe for travel intelligence built on current enforcement reality. Drop a comment with the change that caught you most off guard, or tell us about a February checkpoint experience that confirmed something on this list.